My name is Nina, and 3 days after I buried my father, my stepmother sat across from me in a lawyer's office, slid a will across the polished table, and told me that my dad had left her everything: the house, the savings, every account, all of it, and not one single cent to me, his only child. And then she said, "The thing I will carry to my own grave." She looked at me with something that was almost, but not quite, pity, and she said softly, "He was just so hurt that you couldn't be bothered to come. Nina, at the end he told me he was finished with you." I had spent the last 6 weeks of my father's life being told over and over that my dying father did not want to see me, that he was too tired, that he was resting, that he was somehow angry with me. I had grieved a man who, I'd been led to believe, had turned his face away from me in his final days. And I sat in that office, hollowed out, believing I had failed him, believing the last thing he felt for me was disappointment. I had no idea, none, that a hospice nurse named Teresa had been quietly recording my father during those very weeks. I had no idea that my dad's actual voice, his real last words to me, the truth of what he felt and what he'd done, were sitting on a phone in a kind woman's purse, waiting for me to be ready to hear them. And when I finally did hear them, everything my stepmother had built came apart, not with a courtroom explosion, but with the quiet, unstoppable force of a truth that had been protected from beyond the grave. Welcome to Composed Drama Stories, where the women everyone underestimated finally tell their side. If quiet strength and slow justice are your kind of evening, stay with me. Now, I want to be honest with you up front, because it changes how you'll hear this whole story. That recording did not work the way you're probably imagining. I didn't march into a courtroom and hit play and watch my stepmother crumble. A phone recording of a dying, medicated man is not a will. And it does not, by itself, win you anything, and I'm going to tell you exactly what it did do. And how the truth it carried sent me looking for the thing that actually brought my stepmother down. Because what saved me, in the end, wasn't the recording at all. It was something my father did 15 years earlier, when his mind was clear and his heart was still entirely his own, something my stepmother didn't know existed, and couldn't have touched if she had. The recording just told me where to look. But to understand any of it, the recording, the lie, the thing my father hid in plain sight to protect me, you have to understand my father, and the bond she spent years quietly working to sever. So let me take you back. It was just the two of us, my dad and me, for almost my entire childhood. My mother, Rose, died when I was 7 in illness, fast and merciless, and after that, my father raised me alone. Arthur, Art, to his friends. He was a building contractor, a big, gentle, capable man with sawdust permanently in the creases of his hands, and when my mother died, he did not fall apart. Though I know now that he wanted to. He got up every morning, and he made me breakfast, and he braided my hair badly, and he showed up to every single thing, every recital, every science fair, every scraped knee, and he loved me with a steadiness that became the foundation of my entire life. We were a team. 2 people in a quiet house and a love that didn't need a lot of words. He kept my mother's photographs on the mantel and her wedding ring in a small velvet box in his dresser, and sometimes I'd catch him just holding it, and he'd see me and smile and say, "She'd be so proud of you, Nina Bug. He was the best man I have ever known." I want to give you one memory, because it's the one I held on to through everything that came later. When I was 9, 2 years after my mom died, I got it into my head that I wanted to learn to ride a horse. And we had no money for lessons. None. My dad was a contractor raising a kid alone, so he found a man at a stable outside town who let him fix fences and repair the barn in exchange for lessons for me. Every Saturday, for a year, my father did a full day of free hard labor in the sun so that his daughter could have 1 hour on a horse. He never once told me that's what he was doing. I figured it out years later. That was my dad. He didn't say I love you 100 times a day. He built things, quietly with his hands and his sweat and his foresight, that meant I was loved. He showed it in fences and fixed barns and, as I would learn at the very end, in legal papers filed years in advance to protect a daughter from a danger he couldn't yet name. The man loved in deeds. Remember that, because it's the whole key to how this ends. He was also, and this matters more than I understood at the time, an extraordinarily careful man. A planner. The kind of man who, having lost his wife young and having a daughter depending on him, made sure that everything was in order. Always insurance up to date, papers organized, nothing left to chance. I never want you to be caught off guard the way your mom and I got caught off guard, he told me once. I've taken care of things. You'll always be okay. I didn't think much of it then. It was just Dad being Dad. I had no idea I was hearing a promise that would reach across years and past a locked door to save me. I grew up, and I became a veterinarian. I built a small clinic in the town where I settled, several states away from where I'd grown up, and I poured my life into it, the long hours, the emergency calls at 3 a.m, the animals and the families who depended on me. My dad was so proud he practically glowed. And it was a good life, but it was a demanding one. The kind where you can't just drop everything. And that distance and that demand are going to matter to this story, because they became the wedge that a clever woman used to pry my father and me apart. Because when I was in my mid-30s, my dad retired, sold the old house up north, moved down to Sarasota, Florida, for the sunshine and the fishing, and a couple of years into that new life, he met Suzanne. I want to be fair about Suzanne, as fair as I can be, because the truth is damning enough without me embellishing it. She was younger than my father by a good 15 years. Polished, attractive, attentive. And at first I was glad. I was genuinely glad. My father had been alone a long time, and here was a woman who seemed to dote on him, and I was so relieved that he wouldn't grow old by himself that I ignored the small things, the way she'd subtly correct his stories, the way she managed his calendar, his phone, his friendships, the way, little by little, she became the gatekeeper to my own father. It happened so slowly I almost couldn't see it. I'd call, and she'd answer his phone and say he was napping and that she'd have him call me back, and the call back would come a day later. Or not at all. I'd plan a visit, and suddenly the dates didn't work, or they'd just gotten back from a trip and were too tired for company. When I did see my dad, there was a new hesitance in him, a careful checking of Suzanne's face before he spoke. That broke my heart in a way I couldn't name. And slowly, over a few years, I went from talking to my father several times a week to talking to him through Suzanne, on Suzanne's schedule, in conversations Suzanne supervised. She never did anything you could point to. She just slowly, patiently made herself the only road to him, and then she narrowed that road, inch by inch, until there was barely room for me to pass. I see it so clearly now, the architecture of it. The way you only see a trap after it's sprung. Each individual thing was small enough to be deniable, explainable, the kind of thing you'd feel petty objecting to. A missed call, a rescheduled weekend, A birthday card that came a little late, in her handwriting, signed in his name. If I had ever said out loud, "I think your wife is keeping me away from you," I'd have sounded paranoid and jealous and cruel, and she knew that, and she counted on it. That is how this kind of person works. They never give you one big thing to fight. They give you 100 small things, each one too small to fight, and they let the accumulation do the work. Until one day you look up and realize you haven't had a real, private, unsupervised conversation with your own father in 2 years, and you cannot for the life of you point to the day it became true. And here is the part that I have had to forgive myself for. Because for a long time, I couldn't. I let it happen. Not out of not caring, out of trust, and out of busyness, and out of the simple fact that I could not imagine the depth of what she was doing. I was running a clinic, working myself to the bone, and when my father seemed cared for and happy, I told myself the distance was just life adult kids, and aging parents drift. Everyone says so. I told myself I'd make more time soon. I did not understand that soon was a luxury someone was quietly stealing from me, one rescheduled weekend at a time. Then my father got sick, cancer, and the bad kind, the fast kind. And that is when Suzanne's slow, patient work turned into something ruthless. When he went into home hospice, which means the care comes to the house, for a person who isn't going to recover, to keep them comfortable at the end, I tried to come. God, I tried. I called and said I was getting on a plane. And Suzanne told me, gently, firmly, that the doctors said he needed absolute rest, that visitors agitated him, that it would be selfish of me to come barging in and tire him out for my own peace of mind. She told me he was sleeping most of the time. She told me, and I can still hear her voice doing it, that he'd specifically said he didn't want me to see him like this. And then this is the masterstroke. This is the thing I'll never get over. She started telling me that he was hurt, that he'd been saying he felt abandoned by me, that he didn't understand why I'd been so distant all these years. She fed me, drop by drop, the poison that my own father was angry with me, dying angry with me, and she did it so skillfully, mixed in with so much false sweetness, that I believed her. I believed her. I sat in my house several states away, sick with guilt, certain that the man who'd braided my hair and called me Nina Bug had decided, at the end of his life, that I had failed him. What I did not know, what I would not know until Teresa found me, was that the entire time Suzanne was telling me my father didn't want to see me. She was telling my father that I was too busy to come, that I'd sent my regrets, that I had a lot going on with the clinic and would try to visit if I could get away. She built a wall straight down the middle of the most important relationship of my life, and she stood in the middle of it, telling each of us that the other one had stopped reaching. My father died believing his daughter couldn't be bothered to come say goodbye. I survived him believing my father died, resenting me. She engineered that. On purpose. So that when it was over, the will would make sense. Think about the cold patience that takes to stand at a dying man's bedside and, with one face, comfort him about a daughter who'd abandoned him. And then to step into the next room and, with another face, tell that same daughter on the phone that her father wanted to be left alone. To run that con on two grieving people at once, for weeks, while one of them was actively dying. I have tried many times to understand the kind of person who can do that, and I've stopped trying, because I think understanding it would require me to have something inside me that, thank God, I don't. She wasn't improvising. She was building a story, brick by brick, that she would need to be airtight by the time he was gone. Because a daughter who'd been pushed away and lied to her whole adult life, would believe a will that disinherited her. The lie about the love was the foundation. The will was just the building she put on top of it. He died on a Tuesday. I got the call from Suzanne, who was weeping in a way that I now understand was at least partly performance. And I flew down for the funeral in a fog of grief and guilt so thick I could barely stand. And at that funeral, surrounded by my father's friends' people who looked at me, I noticed, with a strange coolness, because Suzanne had been telling them for years what an ungrateful, absent daughter I was, I felt utterly alone. I had lost my dad, I had lost the chance to say goodbye, and I had lost, I believed, his good opinion of me. I was the loneliest I have ever been in my life. I remember standing near the back during the service, because I genuinely didn't feel I had the right to sit up front. That's what she'd done to me. She'd made me a guest at my own father's funeral. A man I half recognized, one of Dad's old job site friends, came up to me afterward by the coffee urns, and I braced myself for kindness. And instead he looked at me with this flat disappointment and said, "He waited for you, you know, right up until the end." And then he walked away, and I had no defense, because I didn't yet know that the waiting was real, but the story about why I never came was a lie. I just stood there holding a paper cup of coffee I couldn't drink, nodding at people who thought I was the villain of my own father's death. Suzanne moved through that room like a widow, in a play she'd rehearsed for years, accepting embraces, dabbing her eyes, occasionally glancing at me across the room with a look I mistook for grief, and only later understood was assessment. She was checking to see whether I'd broken yet. I had. And 3 days later came the lawyer's office, and the will, and Suzanne sliding it across the table, and he was finished with you. Everything to her, the house, the accounts, his investments, and she made very clear everything in the house, including my mother's photographs and my mother's wedding ring, the little velvet box, which she informed me she'd be going through and deciding what to do with. She was going to sell my dead mother's wedding ring. She said it the way you'd mention clearing out a junk drawer. I want you to understand the completeness of it. She hadn't just taken the money. She had taken my father's final weeks, taken my goodbye, taken my mother's memory, and rewritten my dad's love into rejection. And she was sitting there, watching me absorb it with a calm, satisfied expression that I will see when I close my eyes for the rest of my life. I had no fight in me. I truly didn't. I believed the will. I believed I'd been disinherited by a father I'd disappointed. I went back to my hotel room and I lay on the bed in my funeral clothes, and I felt something inside me simply switch off. And then, the next morning, my phone rang, and it was a number I didn't know. And a warm, slightly nervous voice said, "Is this Nina? Arthur's daughter? My name is Teresa. I was one of your dad's hospice nurses. I'm so sorry to bother you, honey, but I have something that belongs to you, and I've been trying to work up the courage to call. Can I meet you before you leave town? There's something your father wanted you to have, something he asked me to keep safe. Let me tell you about Teresa, because she is the hinge this whole story turns on, and because I need to be very clear about what she did and did not do. I met her in a coffee shop near my hotel. She was an older woman, soft-spoken, with the kind of bone-deep gentleness that hospice work either gives you or requires of you. I've never been sure which. And she told me, with tears in her own eyes, what those last weeks had actually looked like. She told me that my father had asked for me. Constantly, that in his lucid moments he would ask when Nina was coming, and that he'd seemed confused and wounded when he was told I'd sent word that I was too busy. She told me she'd watched Suzanne control every call, every visitor, every piece of information that reached that bed. And she told me that she'd known, the way nurses who sit with the dying come to know things, that something was deeply wrong in that house, that a man was being slowly walled off from his own child in his final days, and that he sensed it, and that it was tormenting him. And then she told me what my father had done about it, because my dad, even dying, even foggy with medication, even isolated my dad, was still a careful man. And somewhere in him he understood that he could not trust the normal channels, that anything he tried to say or send might never reach me. So one afternoon, when Suzanne had stepped out, he had asked Teresa, quietly, if she would do something for him. He asked her to take out her phone and record him so that he could leave a message for his daughter that no one could intercept, edit, or throw away. And Teresa, who had seen this kind of thing before, who knew it might be the only honest thing she could do for a man she'd grown to care about, said yes. And over 3 different afternoons, in stolen moments, she recorded my father talking to me. She slid her phone across the table, and she put in a pair of earbuds, and she said, "I think you should hear this alone, honey. I'll go get us more coffee." And she got up, and she walked away, and she left me with my father's voice. I want to tell you something, because it's the heart of everything I've learned. Teresa did not save me. She would be the first to say so. She didn't fix the will. She didn't march into the lawyer's office. She didn't testify or threaten or expose anyone. All that brave, kind woman did was refuse to let a dying man be silenced, and then hand his daughter the truth and walk away to get coffee so I could fall apart in private. She lit a match in the dark. What I did with the light, all of that, was still mine to do, and it was going to take everything I had. I pressed play, and there was my father's voice, weaker than I'd ever heard it, slower, but unmistakably him, unmistakably my dad. And the first thing he said, before anything else, was, "Hi, Nina Bug. It's your old man. I won't be able to do justice to all of it, and some of it belongs only to me. But I'll tell you the shape of what he said across those 3 recordings, because you need to know what was stolen and what was saved. He told me he loved me. He told me he knew that if I understood how things really were, I'd have been there in a heartbeat. That he never for 1 second believed I didn't want to come. And that whatever I was being told, I should know the truth was that he was asking for me every day. He apologized. My dying father apologized to me for not protecting me better, for letting Suzanne come between us, for being too tired and too proud and too in love to see what was happening until it was too late to fix it the regular way. He told me not to be angry at myself, that none of it was my fault, that I had been a wonderful daughter and the great joy of his life. And then, in the 3rd recording, the weakest one, he told me the thing that changed everything. He said, "Now listen to me, because this is important and I don't have a lot of strength. I know she's going to try to take it all. I know her now, too late, but I know her. Don't you fight her for that house, Nina. Don't you spend a single day of your life in a courtroom over furniture. You don't need it. Because everything that matters, your mother's ring, the things I set aside for you, the real money, I took care of all of that a long time ago, back when my head was clear and my heart wasn't being worked on. Before her. You go and you find Mr. Calloway, in town. He has my papers, the real ones, the old ones. He'll know what to do. It's already yours, baby. It was always yours. She can have the house. You go get what your dad actually left you. It's already yours. It was always yours. I sat in that coffee shop and I sobbed, the ugly kind, the kind that turns heads. And Teresa came back and sat with me and held my hand and didn't say a word. And I cried for my father. And I cried with relief. And I cried because the cruelest lie I had ever been told, that my dad died disappointed in me, had just been dissolved by his own voice. He'd loved me to the very end. He'd fought for me, in the only small way a trapped and dying man could, by whispering the truth into a kind nurse's phone. Suzanne had stolen 6 weeks and a goodbye, but she had not managed to steal the thing she most wanted to steal, which was the truth of whether my father loved me. He had reached past her, past the locked door, past the will, past death itself, to make sure I knew. But here is the part I need you to really hear, because it's where I had to become something more than a grieving daughter. That recording, as precious as it was not going to win me anything in a legal sense, and I knew it, and the lawyer I would soon hire confirmed it. A phone recording of a man in hospice, on heavy medication, with no witnesses to his state of mind, made without any of the formalities a will requires, that is not a legal document. If I had walked into court and tried to play it, Suzanne's lawyer would have argued, plausibly, that it was the confused rambling of a dying, medicated man, or that I'd somehow coerced it, and it might have been thrown out entirely. The recording was the most important thing in the world to me, and legally, on its own, it was almost nothing. My father knew that too. That's why he didn't say, "Play this tape and win." He said, "Go find Calloway." He didn't hand me a weapon. He handed me a map. And it was going to be up to me to follow it. So I dried my face, and I thanked Teresa in a way that no words could ever really cover. And I did not get on my flight home. I changed my ticket, and I stayed in Sarasota, and the next morning, instead of going home to grieve, I went to find Mr. Calloway. Let me tell you what I found. Because this is where my father's careful, foresighted love reached out of the past and saved me, and where my stepmother's greed began, quietly, to destroy her. Mr. Calloway was a semi-retired estate attorney, easily in his 70s, who had known my father for over 20 years since before Suzanne, since back when Dad still lived up north and would fly down to Florida on business. And when I walked into his small office and told him who I was, his whole face changed, and he said, "Arthur's Nina. Oh, I am so glad you came. I read about your father, and I have to tell you, I've been sick about something. Because I saw that the estate was being handled by another attorney, and I couldn't understand it, because Arthur and I set all of this up years ago, and it was airtight. And then he explained to me, slowly and patiently, the thing that changed my entire life, and I'm going to explain it to you the same plain way, because it's the key to everything. A will, Mr. Calloway told me, only controls certain things, the things a person owns outright in their own name when they die, that have to go through a court process called probate. But a great deal of what people own can be set up to pass outside of a will entirely, directly to a named person. No matter what any will says, a trust, for instance, which is a legal arrangement where your assets are held for the people you choose, passes straight to the beneficiaries without ever touching the will. Retirement accounts and life insurance policies pass directly to whoever is named on them. Property can be titled in ways that bypass probate too. It's one of the most important things almost nobody understands about money and death. The will is only the visible part, the part everyone fights over, and very often it's not where the real value lives at all. And here was the thing. Years ago, when his head was clear and his heart was his own, my father had done exactly that. He had quietly placed the bulk of his wealth, his investment accounts, a large life insurance policy, and yes, my mother's jewelry and our family heirlooms, all of it into a living trust, with one beneficiary. Me, he had named me on his retirement accounts. He had built, years before Suzanne ever taught him to doubt me, a fortress around my inheritance that no will could touch, that no manipulation at a deathbed could reach. That didn't depend on his being clear-headed at the end, because he'd had the foresight to do it while he still was. The will Suzanne had slid across that table, the one leaving her everything that will only govern what was left in my father's name alone. The house, and a checking account, and the furniture. That was it. That was the entire inheritance she had so triumphantly claimed. She had stood over me and lied about my father's love and crowed about taking everything, and she'd had no idea, none, that the everything she was claiming was a fraction of what my father actually had, and that the rest of it, the real wealth, had been mine and out of her reach the entire time. She had reached for everything, and in doing so, she had revealed exactly who she was, for a house and a checking account, while the fortune my father built for me sat quietly in a trust she didn't even know existed. I sat in Mr. Calloway's office, and I felt the ground turn solid under me for the first time since my father died. My dad hadn't disinherited me. My dad had armored me years ago, foreseeing maybe not Suzanne specifically, but the general truth that life ambushes you. He had made absolutely sure that whatever happened, however the end went, his Nina bug would be okay. You'll always be okay, he'd told me when I was a girl. I've taken care of things. He had. He really had. Now, I want to be clear, because this is where I had to make real choices and do real work, and where I refused to simply let the lawyers handle it while I went home. There were things I had to actively do, fast. Mr. Calloway warned me that a person like Suzanne, once she realized the trust existed, might move quickly and dishonestly try to access accounts, try to sell off the heirlooms that were legally mine before I could claim them, try to muddy the waters. So I moved faster. I did not get on my flight. I want you to understand what that meant, because it wasn't nothing. I have a clinic full of animals and families who depend on me. And I made the calls and arranged the coverage, and I stayed in Florida in a cheap extended stay hotel for weeks, because I understood that this was a race, and that the prize was my mother's wedding ring and my father's life's work, and I was not going to lose it, because I'd been too polite or too grief-stricken to fight. I worked with Mr. Calloway every single day. We formally asserted my position as the trust's beneficiary. We put every relevant institution, every bank, every brokerage, the life insurance company on written notice that the trust assets were spoken for and were not to be released to anyone else. We moved to legally freeze and protect everything before Suzanne could get her hands near it. And most urgently, we went after my mother's things. Because the ring and the photographs and the heirlooms, those were physically inside that house, in Suzanne's possession, and she had told me to my face that she intended to go through them and sell what she liked. Those items were trust property. They were legally mine. So I didn't beg her for them, and I didn't make a tearful plea she could refuse. I got a formal legal order, recognizing those specific items as belonging to the trust, and therefore to me, and requiring her to turn them over. I made it so that keeping my dead mother's wedding ring would have meant defying a court. I did not sit back and grieve and hope someone would do the right thing. I got up every morning in that Florida hotel room with my father's voice in my earbuds, and I fought for what he'd left me, the smart way, the way he'd told me to methodically, relentlessly, and without ever once giving Suzanne the screaming match she could have used to make herself the victim. And then there was the house, and the will, and the question of Suzanne herself. And here is where I made the choice that I'm proudest of, and where the recording finally did its real work, not as a courtroom weapon, but as the thing that gave me certainty about what kind of fight to have, and what kind not to. I could have gone scorched earth, my father's will the new one. Leaving Suzanne, the house had been signed during his final illness. While he was medicated, while he was isolated, while a controlling spouse stood between him and the world. There is a legal concept called undue influence, which is when someone uses a position of power over a vulnerable person to manipulate them into a decision they wouldn't otherwise make. And another called testamentary capacity, which is just whether a person was truly of sound mind when they signed. And I had a strong case on both. I had Teresa, who had witnessed the isolation and the manipulation and would speak to what she saw. I had the timeline. I had the recording, which, while not a will, painted a devastating picture of a man being walled off from his daughter. I could have contested that will, dragged Suzanne through a long, ugly, public trial, and I think there's a real chance I would have won, and taken the house too. But I remembered my father's voice. Don't you spend a single day of your life in a courtroom over furniture. You don't need it. She can have the house. And I realized he was right, and not because he was being saintly, but because he was being wise. He understood something I needed to understand, that the house was the bait, and that a war over it would cost me years and peace and would keep Suzanne at the center of my life for a decade. He had already given me the only victory that mattered. I had the truth of his love, restored. I had the trust, which was the vast majority of his wealth, secured. I had my mother's ring back. I had everything that was actually his to give and actually meant something. What Suzanne had a house in Florida and a checking account, purchased at the price of her own soul and her standing with everyone who'd ever known my father was, I finally saw. Not a prize. It was a sentence. So this is how the reckoning actually happened. And it was quieter and more final than any courtroom scene. I did not need to expose Suzanne in a dramatic showdown because her own actions had already done it. Once Mr. Calloway formally notified everyone of the trust, the truth of the situation became plain to every party involved, the other lawyers, the financial institutions, my father's friends who'd been so cool to me at the funeral. The picture assembled itself without me having to give a single speech. A careful man had protected his daughter years in advance. A second wife had isolated him, lied to both of us, and then, the moment he died, claimed an entire inheritance that turned out to be a small fraction of an estate she'd had no real claim on, while trying to sell a dead woman's wedding ring. You cannot dress that up. Reality told the story far more damningly than I ever could have. And Suzanne, faced with the trust she couldn't touch, the heirlooms she had to surrender, and the very real threat that I could contest the house too, and put the whole sordid history in front of a judge, Suzanne folded. Her lawyer reached out to mine to resolve things amicably, because the one thing Suzanne could not afford was for the full truth of what she'd done to come out in open court, in front of my father's whole community, on a public record. A contest over the house would have meant testimony Teresa's, about the isolation, mine, about the lies. The timeline of a will signed by an isolated, medicated man. It would have meant the whole town learning exactly what kind of woman she was. So she took the deal that let her quietly keep the house and slink away. And she counted herself lucky, because she understood, finally, that she had gambled everything on the assumption that a dying man hadn't planned ahead, and that the dying man had outplanned her by 15 years. I never had to play the recording for anyone. I want to point that out, because I think people expect this story to end with me standing in a courtroom hitting play and watching her face fall. It didn't. The recording was never for them. It was for me. It told me the truth, and it pointed me to Calloway, and after that, the facts my father had set in stone years before did all the talking. I didn't need to expose Suzanne with a dramatic reveal. Her own reach had exposed her. All I'd had to do was refuse to be too broken to look. She got a house and a checking account. She lost the fortune she thought she was stealing, my mother's ring, and her reputation with every single person who had known and loved my father. The friends who'd looked at me coldly at the funeral learned the truth, and one by one, some of them reached out to apologize. The woman who'd spent years making herself the only road to my father ended up alone in his Florida house, on the wrong side of everyone who'd mattered to him, with a fraction of what she'd schemed for. She reached for the entire inheritance, and the reaching is exactly what cost her. Let me tell you how it all settled, because the deepest part of this was never about the money. I got my mother's wedding ring back. I want to start there, because that small velvet box mattered more to me than every account in the trust. The day the order was enforced and a courier placed it in my hands, I sat in my car in a parking lot and opened it, and there it was, the thin gold band my mother had worn, the one my father used to hold in the evenings, and I cried harder than I had at the funeral. I have it on a chain now, and I touch it sometimes the way my father used to, and I think about how close it came to being sold to a stranger at an estate sale for the price of a nice dinner, and how I got up off that hotel bed and refused to let that happen. I got my parents' photographs, my childhood things, the pieces of my mother that Suzanne would have erased without a second thought. I got my father's wealth, the future he'd carefully, lovingly built into a wall around me, and I'll tell you what I did with a good piece of it. I expanded the part of my veterinary practice that treats animals for families who can't afford care. The kind of quiet, unglamorous good my father would have loved. The kind of thing he did his whole life without ever calling attention to it. I named it after him. Arthur's Fund. He'd have grumbled about the fuss, and then teared up, and pretended he had something in his eye. It felt like the only right way to spend a careful man's careful love, to turn it into more of exactly what he was, which was a person who quietly made sure the ones who couldn't fend for themselves would be okay. But the thing I got back that I treasure most, the thing Suzanne tried hardest to steal and failed most completely to take, was my father himself. The true one. The one who loved me to his last breath, who asked for me every day, who apologized for not protecting me, and told me I was the joy of his life. For 3 days, I believed I'd lost him twice, once to death, and once to a lie that said he'd died resenting me. And then a kind nurse handed me his voice, and I got him back, whole, and I will never lose him again. I still listen to those recordings, on hard days. Hi, Nina Bug. It's your old man. That is the inheritance that mattered. Everything else was just money. I stayed in touch with Teresa, by the way. She came to see the Arthur's Fund Clinic wing when we opened it, and she cried. And I held her hand the way she'd held mine in that coffee shop, and I told her that she had no idea what she'd given me. She said she did, actually. She said that in 30 years of sitting with the dying, The one thing she'd learned is that the people leaving us are almost always trying, with whatever strength they have left, to get the truth to the people they love, and that her whole job, really, was just to make sure the message got through. She'd made sure mine got through. I don't know that anyone has ever done a kinder thing for me in my life. So here is what I learned, and I'll give it to you as plainly as I know how. The cruelest kind of theft is not the kind that takes your money. It's the kind that takes the truth of whether you were loved and rewrites it as rejection. That's what Suzanne was really after. In the end, not just my father's accounts, but my father himself, the memory of him, the meaning of him. She wanted me to live the rest of my life believing the foundation of my whole childhood had crumbled at the end, that the man who raised me had turned away. Because if she could steal that, she could steal everything, and I'd be too broken to fight for any of it. And she nearly did. For 3 days, she had me. The money, it turns out, can be protected by paperwork, but the truth of a love, that's the thing that's most vulnerable to a thief, and the most devastating thing to lose, and the most important thing in the world to get back. So if someone has ever stolen a person from you, that way isolated you, then rewritten the story to say that the distance was your fault, that you weren't wanted, that you were the one who failed. I want you to hear this. Do not accept their version. Do not let the person standing closest to your loved one at the end be the one who gets to write what that love meant. Go looking for the truth. Because real love leaves a trail. It does. I promise you it does. The people who truly love us are almost always reaching for us, even when we can't see it. Even when someone has built a wall between us, even from a hospice bed with their last failing strength. My father reached for me through a nurse's phone, and through a plan he made years before, when his heart was still his own. The thief controlled the present, the calls, the visits, the room, the narrative. But she could not control the past my father had already secured, or the truth he'd already recorded. And that is almost always how it works. The people who steal relationships are working frantically in the now, scrambling to control what you hear today, but love does its quiet work in advance and in permanence. And it waits. You can find it again, if you're brave enough to keep looking past the lie instead of collapsing under it. And here is the thing I most want you to take with you, because it's the thing that saved me on the worst night of my life. The story they tell you about yourself, you were absent, you were ungrateful, he was done with you, is not evidence. It is a weapon, and the fact that it's painful does not make it true. I believed Suzanne's version for 3 days, and those were 3 of the worst days of my life, and every minute of that pain was built on a lie. So before you accept the cruelest story about yourself, the one that says you were not loved, make them prove it. Make reality prove it. Because more often than not, when you go digging, you will find what I found, that you were loved all along, fiercely, to the very end, by someone who was trying with everything they had left to reach you, and that the only thing standing between you and that love was a person who needed you to believe otherwise. And one more thing. The thing my father knew that I had to learn. The people who reach for everything usually lose far more than the people who simply ask for their fair share. Suzanne could have been decent. She could have grieved with me, shared my father's memory with me, kept the house, and lived out a comfortable life with everyone's goodwill. Instead, she reached for all of it lied about a dying man, claimed an entire estate that was never hers, tried to sell a dead woman's wedding ring, and that reaching is precisely what exposed her and cost her nearly everything that actually mattered. Greed overreaches. It cannot help itself. It always, always shows its hand. And when it does, the careful, quiet, patient love of one good man, planted years in the past like a seed, turns out to be stronger than all of it. My stepmother claimed my father's entire inheritance. But my father had already made sure that the only inheritance that ever mattered the truth that I was loved. Completely. To the very end was somewhere she could never reach it. In his own voice. On a kind stranger's phone. Waiting for me to be ready to hear it. If this story reached something in you tonight, if someone has ever tried to steal a person you love by rewriting the truth, share it with someone who needs to hear that real love leaves a trail. Drop a comment and tell me about the person whose love you'd fight to reclaim. Hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next story.